In this episode, I am once again joined by Professor Arthur Versluis, Professor and Department Chair of Religious Studies in the College of Arts and Letters at Michigan State University, author of over 25 books on subjects ranging from Western esotericism, magic, Christian theosophy, ancient mystery schools, and more. In this episode, Arthur discusses his latest book, American Gnosis, in which he explores the surprising connections between the Gnostic tradition and contemporary American spirituality, politics, and popular media. Arthur shows the ways in which Gnostic religious themes explicitly and implicitly express in political groups such as the dissident right, probes Eric Voegelin's theories which propose links between Gnosticism and left-wing political movements, and explores the blend of cosmological and metaphysical gnosis in the writings of David Icke. Arthur also details the key features of Neo-Gnosticism, discusses the meme battles over the Matrix film's Red Pill, and considers the overlaps between Lightwork, conspiracy theories, and Tibetan Buddhism. So without further ado, Professor Arthur Versluis. Arthur Versluis, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
I'm so delighted to be talking with you again, this time about your new book, American Gnosis. Breaking new ground in many areas of scholarship, places that haven't been touched before. It's certainly not treated in this sort of a way, and I hope we'll talk about some of those areas today. But first of all, actually, congratulations on the publication of American Gnosis, Oxford University Press.
Well, thank you. It was a journey to get to the publication of that book because it was so much exploration. You know, it was years in the making, and it was a journey where the starting point is by no means where I ended. And I think that's part of the sense that you're referring to in your kind of overview of the book. So thank you.
How did this book come to be? You said it's a journey, and that's clear, I think. It takes, I think, the reader on a journey also. How did you begin to get a hold on this subject? How did you begin and how did you navigate that research journey? And also, I think we could perhaps situate this book in terms of some of your other works too. American Gurus, which we discussed in the last episode together, or Magic and Mysticism, I think also is referred to a lot here. So perhaps you could situate the book more broadly in terms of your work. And also, I'm very curious indeed, from inception through the journey, how this book came to be.
Yeah, well, there are two things to say in response to that. One is that I've been working on the areas that are germane to this book for decades. And so there are elements of this book that directly connect, sometimes really surprisingly, to something that I published 20 or more years ago. And I didn't expect that. And so in some sense, the book comes out of all of these prior books and themes and subjects and areas of exploration. At the same time, when I started it, I had a plan, which I proposed to Oxford some years ago, and the plan went entirely out the window because as I was writing then and discovering things, then the way that it developed was really surprising. And I didn't expect some of these things. Some of them I expected because I knew, for example, about Miguel Serrano. I knew about Samuel Aun-Weor. So I knew about these different figures. Charles Musès, I actually knew about when I was writing about Christian Theosophy decades ago because he had published a book on that. But once you get into it, it's quite surprising. And it was like day after day, finding new things and then having to process what is the significance of this, right? Because that's another aspect of it. It's not just that you discover this or that figure. It's making sense of it, how do you place this? How do you understand it? And so that's an element of the journey, and I'm taking the reader along with me on that journey, because it is the case that I work through primary texts and I'm working through sources, and that means I'm working through them, trying to understand in the modern world, how does neo-Gnosticism function? How do we understand this? Because it's obviously a presence. And I have a story for you about that. Something that happened quite recently that illustrates how it's the case that these themes are present in society in ways that are completely unexpected. And here I'm talking about neo-Gnosticism, not gnosis as such. And I make a distinction between those, which I think is valid. So those are the two things I would say.
And so the story you have for us is the story of the book. Is that what you're referring to?
No, it's an anecdote that illustrates how these themes are present in society. And that anecdote is this. A few days ago, I had to take my car. I took my car in, and I was in a shop, and I was talking to the mechanic, the guy who's working on it. We were walking through the shop to the car, which was finished, and he said, well, there's a herd mentality in society, and he gave me a social science example of it. He said these folks painted a white line in a mall, and everybody followed the white line to nowhere, except one or two people. And he said one or two people didn't follow the white line, right? This is a mechanic in a shop telling me this story. And then he said, what people don't he looked at me in the eyes and he said, what people don't realize is that this world is ruled by the little god. He said the elite are under the service of the little god, and the little god is deceiving them. Now, what I just told you actually happened, okay? What is he saying in this story? What is he saying? Well, what he's saying is, this is the demiurge. We are under the sway of the demiurge, a false deluded creator deity, okay? Now, this is the guy who worked on an exhaust system on my car. So what I'm saying is that these themes are present in society in ways that are totally unexpected. So anyway, I had to pass that story along. That's an example of how present these themes are.
That's amazing. That sounds exactly like the sort of thing someone might say in Twin Peaks.
Yes, it's the same feeling. It's just like that, where it's so surreal as an exchange that I was just looking at him, processing it as he was saying it, thinking, is this real? Like, which is the same feeling you have watching Twin Peaks, especially Twin Peaks: The Return, which is so surreal. And this episode happened a couple days ago.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And I'd love to trace with you how it is that we've arrived at this sort of a Twin Peaks moment, actually. Before we do, you make an important point about definitions early on in the book. The definitions we've talked so far about Gnosticism, you've mentioned that word, Neo-Gnosticism. That's a difference we should parse. You've also talked about Gnosis and the difference in the book. You write about the difference between cosmological and metaphysical Gnosis. I think we should parse all of these terms. These are crucial. But you've also written that you found it necessary to broaden the definitions here. And in fact, much of what you discovered pressed at the limits of these definitions. To quote the book here, American Gnosis, "Be aware from the beginning that we will have to expand our definitions and uses of such terms like gnosis and awakening, beyond their conventional religious studies significations. I find it necessary to develop more flexible and expansive ways of understanding our subject matter, which is not limited to religion as such, but ranges widely, and including, for instance, politics, technology, society, and media. Indeed, virtually the whole of contemporary global society. So perhaps we could start at the religious studies level of definitions. Gnosis, Gnosticism. What do we mean by these? And how have you found those definitions challenged or needing to be expanded in your research journey?
Well, Gnosticism as congeries of figures and groups in the early Christian era is an alternative way of understanding Christianity that developed, early in the Christian period, and includes a whole series of different themes or different what Ion Ciulianu, the Romanian scholar of religion who taught at the University of Chicago, suggested that there are what are called building blocks. And Gnosticism in the early period can be understood as having certain building blocks. And you see this to some extent in alternative scriptures that you find in a collection called the Nag Hammadi Library. But what I discovered was that the building blocks that you can find, you can see these elements in the Nag Hammadi Library. For example, Gnosis, the idea of direct spiritual experience, is there in the Gospel of Thomas. The idea of demiurge, false, a deluded creator that thinks he's God but is not really God. And then there's the idea of a true God or a hidden God. The idea of archons or spiritual powers that are sometimes hostile to human spiritual progress. These themes are there in this early Christian period. You see them in the Gospel of Philip, some of them, for example, and you see the female divine figure in Thunder Perfect Mind. So all these themes exist. But what you find in the modern period, in the 20th century, is that these themes get extracted, and with a figure like Hans Jonas, they get generated into a 20th century interpretation of Gnosticism that becomes dominant. It comes becomes popular. It merges into popular society to a much broader degree. And you see these elements starting to appear in American films. You start seeing it in American literature, but it's not Gnosticism from this early period. It's the themes, the building blocks that I mentioned that start to reappear. So you see the idea of a false creator God in movies. You start to see themes of hostile archons. You start to see the theme of divine feminine. All these different aspects start to reappear, you could say almost spontaneously and individually. So it's not that that people are necessarily consciously replicating ancient Gnosticism. It's that a new phenomenon begins to develop in the 20th and 21st century, which I call neo-Gnosticism. And like this gentleman in the auto shop that I mentioned, he's not a scholar of ancient Gnosticism. He's not reading the Nag Hammadi Library. Where did he pick up on this? I don't know. But for sure, these themes are out there in social media, and I show that in the book. So that's one thing to say, is that there's a difference between what I call neo-Gnosticism, which is the reemergence of these themes in contemporary society, how that happens. There's a variety of ways. And then secondly, there's a difference between what I call cosmological gnosis and metaphysical gnosis. And cosmological gnosis has to do with this world, you could say this worldly thing. So for example, politics is this worldly. Political gnosis fits broadly under cosmological in the sense that it's concerned with this worldly things. Metaphysical gnosis is what you see, for example, when the word gnosis is used in Tibetan translations of Tibetan Buddhist works. That is the purest, I would say, pure form of what I'm terming here metaphysical gnosis. So gnosis in this case is not political. It's not, it is purely essentially transcendent in a way that you see, you could encapsulate in, for example, the Heart of Wisdom Sutra, but which you also find in Western texts. So, for example, you look at a figure like Dionysius the Areopagite, classical Christian mysticism, very similar to what you find also in Tibetan Buddhism. And that essentially is, in the case of Dionysius the Areopagite, in his mystical theology, he says it is not seeing, it is not hearing, it is not from tasting, it's not conceptual, it's not. So this whole series of negations characterizes what I'm terming metaphysical gnosis. And so there are two aspects, two kind of sets of themes in the book, and those two classes, you could say, of knowledge. And cosmological knowledge is fundamentally very different than metaphysical gnosis. And these two categories recur all the way through the book. And I think they're important to understand because they help us see how, when you find these themes of demiurge or archons, or being trapped in a hostile society, those themes are not the same as metaphysical gnosis. They're separate, largely, not completely, but largely. And so there's so many different aspects to what we're looking at in the book that it's really worthwhile to think through and understand these conceptual distinctions.
Yes, I'd like to return to these bricks of Gnosticism, the 10 bricks of Gnosticism, as Culianu put it. But first, you recount the anecdote of Elle, a woman you had a conversation with who told you she had had an awakening. And this, I think, really strikes to the difference between the cosmological and metaphysical gnosis. What does awakening mean? Your mind, you went straight away, of course, to, well, awakening. Well, the sort of people who get awakened, they're Buddhas. They become Buddhas, right? You thought right away of that metaphysical type of gnosis. But that was not, in fact, what Elle was talking about. To quote American Gnosis here, Elle sees a narrative completely different than the one conveyed in mainstream media. For her, Donald Trump is not a politician, but an heroic figure who, while of course a human being with his own quirks or foibles, has nonetheless chosen to serve as a vehicle for the powers of good and light and liberty. He and the powers of light are being oppressed by the powers of darkness, the archons as represented by the deep state, and utterly corrupt political figures who have in essence sold their souls to the mercenary devil. Her narrative is implicitly neo-gnostic, or to put it another way, very closely resembling contemporary popular forms of neo-Gnosticism. So I wonder if you might talk about this term awakening and parse that in this difference between metaphysical and cosmological awakening, and why this was so surprising to you to hear her talk in these terms.
Well, when someone says I'm awakened, I've had this enlightenment experience. You think enlightenment, that's my natural. I thought she was referring to awakening in a Buddhist sense, and somebody that's awakened is a Buddha, exactly as you say. But that wasn't what she was talking about at all, really. It was really a narrative about what's happening in society. It's essentially a political, social narrative. And the awakening is awakening to hidden dimensions of political, social reality. And this is definitely cosmological. From this point of view, there's this cosmological awakening that's happening. And she awoke. She awoke to this reality of a battle between light and darkness. And it really didn't have that narrative that she told me. It really doesn't have anything to do with awakening in the Buddhist sense at all. That's why I say in the book, there's neo-Gnosticism without gnosis, and then there's gnosis without neo-Gnosticism. And that's really true in the book. And so she's an example of neo-Gnostic thinking, not in the sense that she is explicitly Gnostic, but that neo-Gnostic bricks or elements are present in her way of seeing the world. So this worldview is neo-Gnostic in this sort of Chuliano sense of these different not neo-Gnostic elements. She sees a battle between light and darkness. She is awakened to the reality, to the hidden things that are happening in society, and those are political, but they're actually spiritual. This is neo-Gnostic, and it's neo-Gnostic in this sense. And it has nothing to do with gnosis or awakening in the Buddhist context, or little. I would say little. I won't say nothing, because I think there are links, you could say, or there is crossover, but it's not that much, right?
What is the little crossover that you can see?
Well, that there is this, there are these themes that you see in some of these figures. So, for example, I talk about Stephen Huller, and I talk about the neo-Gnostic, the Gnostic church that he's developed, and his life story. And his life story, he's a founder of American Gnostic Church in California and author of many books on Gnosticism. And his life story is that he left behind communism and a communist worldview, and moved into a Gnostic worldview. And so there are some themes in his work that are very similar to what you see in this woman that I start the book with and recur to occasionally, who had these kinds of experiences. So what I would say is there are different levels or aspects to this kind of understanding. And so I'm not saying that it's completely disconnected. So Gnosis and Neo-Gnosticism are not completely disconnected. And the political narrative is not completely disconnected from Buddhism either. And we can go into that if you want. It's there in the book, actually. One of many things that are, I think, challenging will be challenging for some people in the book, because it challenges the conventional ways of understanding things unexpectedly, and unexpectedly to me. I didn't expect these things.
I think I know which section you're referring to. Let's go there. I'll quote another line from American Gnosis. You say, essentially, political gnosis, as we see it in this book, is expressed as waking up to the lies of the prevailing system. This idea of waking up to the lies of the prevailing system, it's not inherently a left or a right idea. And you detail how certain Gnostic bricks, if we take this terminology from Culiano, kind of express or are expressed across the political spectrum. On the right, it's expressed in a certain way, which lies are being woken up to and which system has been hiding them or obscuring them. On the left, it's another different set of lies that are being woken up to, a different kind of system, almost inverse sometimes, the two of them, a different sort of system that's been disguising the truth behind the scenes. This sort of political gnosis, this awakening in that sense, you detail that very interestingly on both the left and the right. And that's very fascinating indeed. And what about its interaction with Buddhism? So I don't know if we should say something about this political gnosis before we go further into how this intersects with Buddhism, in particular American Buddhism.
Well, there are different ways to look at this, different lenses and angles, because, that's the thing about this book. This is what makes this book so mind-bending, is that there are all of these different elements that are almost certainly unexpected for a lot of people. And once you start to delve into with me what's going on here, you can't help but feel some shift in how you see things. That's my own experience in the book. And so in writing the book, and the political dimensions, it just depends where you're looking at. So I have a chapter, for example, on psychedelics and psychedelic gnosis. And people who are into psychedelics, a neo-gnostic worldview makes some natural sense. Why? Because you have gnosis, which is provided by the psychedelics. You have the system around you that is opposed to the psychedelics and makes them illegal. You have and that's explicit in some of the texts that I look at, using Gnostic texts, actually, Gnostic language. So the key here is, when neo-Gnostic language tends to come into play, when you are under, when the individual, the author, the meme creator feels that there is a corrupt system that is holding you in its grip and preventing you from knowledge of the truth. That, in a nutshell, is what you see in psychedelic gnosis, in psychedelic neo-Gnosticism, rather, and what you see definitely on the right. And I discuss in the book, and also in an article that I did, I discuss how people on the right, and here I would say essentially the dissident right, although it's broader than the dissident right per se. Dissident right is an actual term used by people on the right. The word dissident it harks back to, and it is their term, it's not my term. It harks directly back to being a dissident, like Solzhenitsyn in a gulag in the Soviet Union. And that language is, in turn, completely contiguous with a neo-Gnostic worldview. And so that's why you find our memes on the right, in Gab, for example. And those memes are using themes like archons. So you have a meme I have a whole collection of memes on my personal website, and they arthurversluis.com, and they are what they are. I mean, they illustrate the themes in the book. These are memes I found, so deal with it. That's the memes. And the memes include archons in the White House. They include the red pill from the Matrix as gnosis. They include all kinds of things. And that happens. When I found it, I was thinking, why is this here? Well, this is, I have to process, okay, this is weird. There's all these Gnostic memes, neo-Gnostic memes on the right. Why? And so I have to come to understand why. And it's because the neo-Gnostic themes fit with a dissident right, a right that sees itself under assault, as being threatened, as being persecuted, fits very well with Gnosticism, neo-Gnosticism, really. So that's what I would say about that, in a short version.
And what about how that same meme or that same brick expresses itself, or might express itself, to the left? Now, of course, there's a spectrum here. You're talking about the dissident right. L before, the anecdote about L, That's going almost in the QAnon direction, which is not synonymous with the dissident right by any means, but it's it's in that direction, to the right towards direction. But similarly to the left, there are stages and degrees of Gnostic ideas that, or ways in which this Gnostic brick in particular, this political gnosis, can be expressed. I wonder if you might detail some of those. Whether or not the analysis that the gnosis is forwarding is correct or not, it's the structure of the argument, the structure of the analysis, which has that Gnostic quality to it.
Well, I looked for, examples of memes on the left that, I looked for things that would really correspond. The problem is that if you think about it, the memes, neo-Gnostic memes, implicitly and really explicitly often depend on power, a particular kind of power dynamic. And so when you look at power, when you look at power dynamics, for example, I live in Michigan. Right now, the left controls every single element of government in Michigan. So the Democratic Party controls the Supreme Court, the governorship, the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, both houses of the legislature. And so in what way could you see, if you see them as archons, here I'm talking politically, you see them as archons, you see them as a demiurge, and you're on the left, you've got real cognitive dissonance. It's just not, it doesn't work, if you see what I'm saying. Because the power structure is actually on the left. How would the neo-Gnostic memes work? How would the neo-Gnostic, because it implies that there's a deluded creator deity, a Truman Show happening, like the movie Truman Show. You have these powers, sinister powers in control. Well, if it doesn't work. And so now it does work a little bit in terms of the language. So, and it works if President Trump is in power, then he's the demiurge or archon figure. And so then it all sort of works, right? And then the language also works because you have woke, and people are, to some extent, are backing away from the term woke because it's taken on a certain negative quality to some extent in a lot of people's, or at least some people's thinking, according to polling, at least. Some statistically, there's some polling that would suggest that, but woke is awakened, right? So you're waking up to the reality of racism. You're waking up to the reality of power structures in society. And if President Trump is in charge, then he's the demiurge or archon figure. And so then it works on the left, right? Then the neo-Gnostic language works. And so it's a totally different analysis, but it can work. It's just that it doesn't fit as well if there's a power structure that is actually not, that doesn't fit with it. And so that's what I would say about that. The neo-Gnostic memes could work on the left, but they don't for the most part. And that's because of the power structure that's in place.
I wonder if the power structure is as important as the perceived locus of power. And what I mean by that is, let's think of some Gnostic memes for the left. Now, once again, I'm not commenting on the accuracy of the analysis of what these memes might be saying, merely in their structure.
Right.
In terms of, can it be mapped? Is there a Gnostic whiff about them? A brick of Gnosticism to follow Culianu? Well, the demiurge, that system, I think you mentioned it, whiteness. That's this force of colonialism and oppressive tyranny. It's a sort of egregore of demiurge-ish force that keeps, that enforces its own sort of interests at the expense of everybody else, or patriarchy and its foot soldier misogyny, which for centuries has oppressed not only women, of course, naturally, but also men, forcing them into various roles and forcing them into various behaviors which are bad for them. Now, once again, I'm not saying if I agree or disagree with any of that, or whether it's right or not, just that there's this sort of force out there that is over us. And when we awaken a consciousness to those forces, we begin to see them everywhere. You put on the glasses from those Roddy Piper glasses that you reference from They Live in the book. You reference those, and suddenly you see it: whiteness everywhere, misogyny everywhere. Does that, to you, have the ring of Gnosticism about it? And if not, or if so, why? And if not, why?
Well, it's really interesting because you find on the right two different ways of seeing Gnosticism. And this is relevant to what you're saying, because what I do in the book is essentially I just explore, where do you find neo-Gnosticism? Where do you find these bricks? I mean, I didn't really go to looking at video games or anime or cartoons or films with an agenda. It's just that this is what you find. And same in literature, this is what you find. And where you look for memes, this is what you find. And when you look at the right, what you see is a kind of double view. And this is relevant to your question, because on the one hand, you find these neo-Gnostic memes, right? Which are that there's this power structure in place and it's oppressive, and here are these archons, and here's the demiurge, and so on. Then you also find, paradoxically, the exact opposite of that, which is the inquisitorial memes that hate Gnosticism and see it as the source of evil. And so you've got these people wandering around right now who see the source of evil as the source of the left's tendencies is Gnosticism. And so this goes back to, you find it voiced by a scholar by the name of Eric Voegelin. Eric Voegelin published books about how Gnosticism was the source of communism. It was the source of communist oppression. So the problem with communism, where did Marxism come from? Well, it was actually Gnostic. And this is the argument. And so Gnosticism is the sinister force that makes its way through history, and then of course Voegelin himself expanded it to everything occult. So occultism, esoteric thought, and so on is all of one piece, right? This is late in life, he says this, and I quote him on this, and then a follower of his as well, a later follower, and then there's a podcaster going around today saying the source of all evil in society really is you got faith and reason, and then you got Gnosticism, which is the evil source, and that's what produces communism, and then all the genocides and murders and everything else, all that comes from Gnosticism. So that view is present on the right. So you have this complete bifurcation, self-opposed, and then you have, yes, you have this language of woke, or wokeism, or I'm woke, and so on the left, but then you have the identification of that on the right with Gnosticism as a pejorative. So that has to be brought into this because that exists out there as an interpretive structure. So then there's the third thing, which is what you suggested, which is, yes, there's this set of oppressive structures, and what we need to do is and they're pre-existing, so whiteness or patriarchy, and so all these need to be broken down. But then what you don't really find a lot of, at least I haven't found it, is that being explicitly identified with Gnosticism. Why? Well, actually, Marxism has historically and communism have largely been anti-religious. And specifically, of course, religion is the opiate of the people, is the quote, opiate of the masses and that sort of thing. But here I'm talking in practice. So, and this is a problem actually in the Buddhist world, I think, in that in the American Buddhist world, you have, on the one hand, broadly speaking, a lot of identification with actually Marxist worldview. And yet, paradoxically, when you look at Marxism as it manifested, or communism as it manifested in Tibet, it didn't look good. I mean, the way that history played out in Tibet, we all know, we can go look at it. Tibetans in general don't really talk about it very much. I mean, expatriate Tibetans, but the destruction, the cultural destruction of Tibet is itself, it can be laid directly. I mean, it's not a hypothetical. It can be laid directly at the feet of communist China, right? So that is something that I think needs to be thought through a little more clearly, what the relationship is between social justice and the left and communism, and then the history of the communist destruction of Tibet. Those are things to think through. And I'm not sure that we've all thought them through that well. So I just throw that out there.
Yes, that's very interesting indeed. The difference between explicitly referencing Gnostic ideas and themes and perhaps unknowingly espousing them. You write about this in the book directly. I'll quote you here. Gnosticism, as filtered through contemporary lenses, recur in new contexts because they so perfectly suit new circumstances. It's not so important whether the creators of films like The Truman Show or The Matrix or Dark City or They Live had ever heard of ancient Gnosticism. Again, what Culiano terms direct transmission is not necessary. Rather, the creators of such films only had to realize in film symbols and metaphors that recapitulate bricks, essential in the Gnostic worldview. And you go on to say later, the phenomena of Neo-Gnosticism is essentially the rediscovery of intellectual bricks or elements that correspond to and symbolize aspects of contemporary society, especially those involving censorship, corporate or elite power, oligarchy, control, conspiracies, and a pervasive sense that mainstream reality is falsified or deceptive. Do you see then in some of those characteristics that we've painted of certain left views, do you see the bricks of Gnosticism in there? You've said you don't see a direct referencing of Gnosticism, which one sees on the right explicitly. And you've mentioned there are books about that, there are podcasters about that. I think I know who you mean. I think that would be a very interesting dialogue. It would be very interesting indeed. If his first name begins with J and the second name with L, I think that would be a very cool dialogue indeed. And do you see the bricks of Gnosticism, Culiano's bricks, in the left, or is that not quite? Does that not quite fit?
In general, I would say I don't see a lot of it. It just hasn't been that present in the popular language. Now, you see this play out in. I'll give you an example of this. Okay, how this plays out. The Matrix, and I talk about this in the book, the Matrix films became they produced this language, the Matrix films, the language of the red pill. And so the red pill becomes very wide, as a term, becomes very widely disseminated on the right. And people say, have you taken the, and it's not just the red pill, it's the white pill. Later on, it's the white pill and the black pill. And, you know, there's all kinds of pills, right? And I can't even keep track of all the pills there are. But there's a whole pharmacy, I guess. But the red pill is the main pill, right? Because that's the pill that Neo, you can take the red pill and go as deep as a rabbit hole or something, right? So the red pill is widespread on the right, and here, not just the dissident right. So once you take the red pill, you see the what's wrong in society. You see the archons of the FBI and the CIA and the NSA and so on, and you see the Mr. Smiths, and you see the lies, as Ella said, right? That's the way it's used on the right. So then, and this highlights an answer to your question, then you see the creators of the Matrix films get pissed off that the right is doing this. And so they say, and the writers say, we got to take the memes back from the right. We got to take the red pill back. And so they create a film which is intended to take the memes back, to take the red pill back from the right explicitly. I mean, they said this explicitly. But did it work? Did it work? In other words, did people suddenly start saying red pill on the left? Did they start saying, oh, red pill, to understanding that President Biden is a genius? Okay, is that the red pill? No, nobody says that. Nobody's using the red pill in this way. And so it didn't work. It didn't work at all. And in fact, there's a lot of anger around this, because I remember seeing various people. I think one of the Trumps used the term, I red pill, and it produced this extremely acrimonious exchange that I won't go into, where you don't have the right to use it, right? But it's out there. And this is how things play out on a political level. And this fits in this kind of cosmological battle that you see with these different figures in the book. And here I'm saying that the language is of a cosmological battle that these folks are using. And this goes back, example of that is Miguel Serrano. Miguel Serrano is a Latin American, South American author who used essentially neo-gnostic language to create this giant narrative of a cosmic battle. It's literally a cosmic battle of light and dark. And that language, I didn't create it. I'm not endorsing it. It's just there. And so I don't see quite that same thing happening on the left. And I think the reason for that is that fundamentally what you have, broadly speaking, in terms of the history of the left, is a hostility to religious language and a hostility to religion. That was a point I made in terms of Tibet. And that's why I think that hostility to religion extends also to using this kind of language. I can see it happening. I don't exclude it. I say in the book, I wouldn't be surprised to see it. It's just that I don't see it happening in the same way right now. And I don't see it in these authors that we're looking at, like Serrano, obviously, because Serrano clearly identifies with the right and not the left. So, that's just how it is,
Yeah, very interesting indeed. And that's your key refutation then of the, if you want, meme or the idea in some sectors of the right that actually the left is itself Gnosticism. Actually, that it's rooted in that Marxism, Hegel, etc. It's Gnosticism, and it's a conspiracy throughout the ages. It goes there too. It's a conspiracy throughout the ages, or at least it is a meme, an idea that reemerges. It doesn't need, as Culiano puts it, direct transmission for an idea to resurface. So that's your main refutation then of that, is that Marxism is so fundamentally, in your view, anti-religious, at least in practice, that it can't quite even become an expression of the religious impulse of neo-Gnosticism.
It's complicated in this sense that you do have state religion. You have political religion that emerges as pseudo-religion. It's not religion, but it's pseudo-religious language. It's pseudo-religious pomp and circumstance. It's taking the place of religion, you could say. So I say it's a little more complicated in that there is some truth in what Voegelin said. I'm not completely discounting his way of seeing the world, in the sense that what Voegelin argued, and you get this in subsequent authors who use it in some cases quite thoughtfully, this idea of creating a second reality, creating that what happens with neo-Gnosticism is people, and this is a Voegelinian critique, is that, Marxists, for example, create a second reality, a false reality, which they try to impose on this world and this reality. And that's the source of all the, that's not a bad, it has an interpretive framework. It's pretty interesting when it's applied, for example, to terrorism. Some examples of terrorism. There's a book on this that does that very well, actually. This idea of terrorism emerges from this imposition of a second reality that substitutes for the actual reality of the world. And once you get far enough into your second reality, you're willing to kill people. You're willing to murder. You're willing to blow people up. Why? Because you're living in a delusional second reality. And so that, so far that you're disconnected from this world. And that, that book has that example has some explanatory power. But that analysis, that worldview itself comes from the right. You see what I'm saying? That's the thing. Both examples that I gave come from the right. And my view is it's complicated because I understand there are these different elements that we're talking about. So I'm not making a blanket, like simple-minded case that there's nothing to the Voegelinian case, let's say. There are elements within the Voegelinian view that have some explanatory power. However, when it is applied, and here's the problem, when it's applied in a kind of dunderheaded idiot fashion, where you take it as almost like you take it like a blunderbuss, and you say everything in the world that I don't like is Gnostic. And Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia were Gnostic because they murdered a lot of people. They must have been Gnostic, right? Well, that is a bridge too far. Okay. Why? Because now we're talking about something that is so disconnected from essentially the entire history of Gnosticism, Neo-Gnosticism, the different historical connections and threads and all the themes. And now we're just applying the term disconnected from everything historically and saying that what I don't like is Gnostic. That doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work as an argument. It just becomes an epithet. And an epithet is not an argument. So that's a dunderheaded way. Okay, that's kind of a dunderhead. But here, what I'm trying to do is be a little bit careful in terms of recognizing that there are distinctions to be made. And there are things to be said that about how Voegelin or others have used the term. So I think Voegelin was wrong in the way he made his arguments. I think it doesn't really make a lot of sense. I don't think Marxism is Gnostic. I don't think it works. But still, there are elements of what he said that have some value. So that's what I would say.
Something else I found very interesting. We're talking now about right wing, we're talking about neo-Gnosticism as it appears often very explicitly in the right wing. This is very much in the, as you put it, cosmological gnosis. There's awakening to political or systemic archons and demiurges in all but those names, and sometimes explicitly referred to as those names. But there's also a sense in which that can, in some cases, go into a kind of metaphysical gnosis. I'm thinking here, the person you give as the prototypical example of this is David Icke. David Icke has this cosmological gnosis aspect to him. I'd love if you could explain why that is. And also, he goes beyond, it seems, at times, to this metaphysical gnosis. Cosmological gnosis, hard duality, hard dualism. It's almost one of its defining characteristics. Metaphysical gnosis transcends or goes beyond duality. This is one of it. And so there's somewhat, should we say, uncomfortable bedfellows perhaps, or maybe not. So I wonder how those two things exist and how a figure like, for instance, David Icke, who you talk about in the book, manages to navigate that scope of different types of gnosis, if we can put it like that.
Well, he's such an interesting character. And, I was aware of him many years ago. I actually referred to him years ago, and because he had come up with this narrative of the reptilians that he had gotten from a South African figure, actually, or at least I had a South African that he interviewed that had kind of a South African shaman figure, you could say, using the term very loosely, who had said that there were these shape-shifting fourth-dimensional reptiles that were dropping in and out of out of global society and taking power, and they take on human form. And it was so wild, this stuff, so wild and out there. And that's my first encounter with him. In video, these were in VHS. I got the VHS and looked at them and thought, wow, this is something. And then years later, Icke continued to develop. He continued to become a more and more charismatic, I would say, popular figure, not only in Britain, not only in the UK, but also in the US. He's to some extent a global influence, and he undertook a journey. And you see a journey in his work, and I go through that journey of his work, where he goes. And it's very interesting because sequentially he goes through book by book, you can see, to a position that's basically on the right. It's basically what you see in the dissident right. So he's writing about anti-white movement, anti-white politics. He became well known for his opposition to the vax, to COVID-19 vax. He was a very, very strong opposition, and that's a position that many people like Ella, this woman that I mentioned in the book, discuss in the book. She's emblematic of others that I also have discussed this with and know, who are in this kind of, you could say, light worker community. And they also are anti-vax and see the vaccine as part of a kind of plot or a conspiracy or a, and so there's so many different elements to this that it's hard to parse it all out. But there's another element of Icke I want to mention, and that is his work opens up, and this is very explicit on his part, into spirituality. He is encouraging and awakening to the powers, he says, the powers that control society, but he's also emphasizing waking up in the sense of you could say classical perennialist spirituality, which is, waking up to meditation, to, these different aspects that you could really, I think, a neutral observer would say this is, you could say, I'm not sure New Age, but non-confessional spirituality of a kind of yoga, type. It's not explicitly Buddhist. It's maybe a little bit Hindu, maybe a little bit Buddhist, but in a kind of neutral way, a kind of non-aligned spirituality. That's there in his work. So Icke is an example of that, but he is by no means the only example. Actually, when you look at Stephen Huller and his life journey away from communism to a spirituality that is broadly on the right, you could say. When you see, for example, Joel Morwood, I mentioned him. He went to China. He was given a tour of China, and then he ultimately ended up in a kind of perennialist spirituality that's not that far from David Icke. It's somewhat far because it's, I think, much more developed. He's really not political at all. He's much more directly spiritual, but there are common themes here, right? There are common themes, and that is this kind of trajectory that you see in Icke is not that far from the other trajectories that we're talking about. It's not that far. They're not identical. I'm not saying they're identical, but I'm saying there are common themes. So does that answer your question?
Yes. Yes, it does. And I think you mentioned that this cosmological gnosis, this awakening to the sense that there are systems in place or overarching powers of a worldly or maybe otherworldly or maybe supernatural or extraterrestrial nature, right? These are all aspects of ways in which that meme is expressed. Pretty depressing, actually. So one needs, you talk about this sort of suicidal nihilism that sort of a view might very well evoke. And if I understood you correctly, you're hinting at, suggesting that part of Icke's transcendental gnosis is an answer to that question. Well, there has to be something bigger than the archons. There has this deus otiosis. There has to be, I mean, that's, of course, that is in Gnosticism, of course, but Gnosticism has been suicidal at times in its history. I mean, Manichaeism and so on, with the perfect ones starving themselves, that sort of thing. So that impulse has always been there. But it's almost as if this transcendental gnosis is, should we say, an antidote to that nihilism? Could that be the case? Is that how it functions, do you think? Not in terms of whether it's right or wrong, but in terms of whether it serves that function within the ecosystem of the worldview.
Well, that's what you've captured exactly the approach. That's exactly the same approach that I have in the book, which is, I'm just looking at these things and this is what I find, and here we are. And so how do we make sense of this? And that's what you suggest there is a real insight. Yes, I absolutely agree. And I actually give some examples of people. These are folks they're Redditors, people from Reddit, people from other sources that I quote, who are very depressed because they go through this political, they come to see this political cosmological worldview, which is see the conspiracies, they see it's very negative set of rabbit holes. This is what they say. I quote some folks who are, here I've gone down all these rabbit holes and now I feel totally depressed. I feel horrible. I mean, they say this. And what do? Well, so Icke provides this positive side, which is, meditate, spirituality. So in some ways, it's a springboard into that. What he's endorsing, what he's advocating, instead of this kind of dead end, right? Or it's a counter to the dead end kind of depression. And then when you look at the figures that I'm discussing at the end of the book, who are gnosis without neo-Gnosticism, they don't have any of that stuff. So you just don't find among those figures, you don't find the archons and the demiurge and the conspiracy and the, or if you do, it's minimal. And instead, it's primarily the spirituality and transcendence. And that's the emphasis. So that's an interesting distinction that you make. And I think you're absolutely right about that.
You're talking there about the figures at the end of the book that you mention, Alan Wallace and others.
Franklin Merrill Wolfe, Alan Wallace,
right.
Joel Morwood. They're those are figures that and Stephen Huller, those are the ones I primarily.
Right. I wonder if this is another, and this might be a stretch, or it might be too low resolution. I wonder if this is another area where Gnosticism and Buddhism might overlap. There's a fairly depressing assessment of the state of things, samsara. Pretty depressing, really. Round and round it goes. Everything you do gets you deeper in it. That sort of thing. But there is a way out. There's a problem, we have the solution. And that problem-solution paradigm has been expressed differently throughout Buddhism's history. And inside of Buddhism itself, there's been a great deal of dialogue about that. What exactly is the right solution to suffering? Is it to simply extinguish or end one's participation in it, to extinguish oneself, that earlier sense of enlightenment? Or the Mahayana, almost light worker approach of to become bodhisattvas, and over lifetimes, through our light work, of course I'm deliberately now mixing the terms, bring awakening to ourselves, of course, progressively, but also to all other sentient beings, sort of becoming kind of bodhisattva, light worker in a way. Or, actually, we can recast this idea of suffering itself. We can discover the Buddha nature underneath it all. The suffering it's a layer, it's a covering, but within that covering, underneath the mud, is that precious material, that golden material. That metaphor is used, for example, in the Gulama. They have those 9 different similes of Buddha nature, for example. So there's a reframing, is what I'm attempting to say, of this problem-solution paradigm. Is this perhaps an overlap between Gnosticism and the Buddha?
Well, there's a spectrum in looking at these different themes. One of the things that I discuss in the book are light workers in the light worker community on the right. And Ella's kind of worldview of, Trump is a figure of light, and the light workers, from that worldview, in that worldview, there is a continuity between light work and conspiracy theory. They're close, but they're not identical. And the light working part then at the other end moves over into what is essentially transcendence of these different themes, and it's aloof from them. Doesn't have much to do with them. There's a transition point between these, and that transition point here on the spectrum, this area is occupied by in one part secular, and then in another part religious. And so what is that crossover between secular and religious, or secular and spiritual? Well, it's pretty hard to determine, but it's there. So is a light worker secular, or is a light worker religious, right? It's hard to say when you talk to a light worker exactly what a light worker is doing. But once you move over into Buddhism, and it's explicitly Buddhist, then you're in religious territory, and you know it's religion, right? And so then you have there are people who are identify themselves either explicitly or implicitly with the right, who are Buddhists. Buddhism is not 100% left. I mean, I'll give some examples. There's the Dalai Lama, I quote in the book at some length. He's a Zen practitioner in Japan who is very much in this transition area here. He's clearly Buddhist. He's a Buddhist practitioner in Japan, in a monastery, who is very much identified with the right. That's an example. And also highly critical of the vaccines and other vaccine and other things, or vaccines. Then you have, and DK Dharmaraj, Dharma King. Another would be Brad Warner. I mentioned him in the book. The Dharma Squad, the right-wing Dharma Squad. There are folks who are in this kind of intervening area, and then you have people like Morwood, who I discuss in the book, who's using Gnostic terminology, Joel Morwood, and is definitely coming from a Buddhist perspective largely, but does not identify with Buddhism. And yet he does identify with Buddhism. So he's a perennialist. And he's using Gnostic language to describe himself. So what I'm saying is there's this spectrum here, and where you fit on it, I'm not exact, these different folks fit, I'm not sure. But I have a general idea. And so that's why I say it's not necessarily the case that it's a complete barrier between neo-Gnosticism and Gnosis, and claims of Gnosis, assertions of Gnosis, you could say. I would say it's a spectrum, and the people that we're talking about bridge it. They bridge it. They have feet in both of these different areas, and so does David Icke. So that would be what I would say. And ultimately, yes, there's this in Buddhism, the idea of samsara as suffering, and that is a much clearer way of understanding than I think the neo-Gnostic one. The neo-Gnostic one does have some diagnostic value in certain situations, right? Whereas Buddhism tends to be much more explicit and clear in its language, and it's much clearer in terms of analysis of relationship between samsara and nirvana than some of the other things we've been talking about.
And there's no demiurge, and there's no archon. Yeah, there's no grand conspiracy of samsara per se. That element, which is really crucial to the Gnostic view, if I'm reflecting on my own question, that is quite clearly a difference. There's no archon, there's no demiurge, there's no conspiracy of samsara per se. It's a sort of neutral event, actually.
Well, there is Mara. There is delusion. There's delusion and the powers of delusion, and in prophecies, there's Mara as a in the prophetic tradition, Mara is a thing, right? Mara is a figure, it's an entity, or given entity, provisional entity status. And there's there are these there's such a profusion of entities in Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, in terms of spirits of so many different kinds. And some of these have genealogy that goes way back in Tibet, actually pre-Buddhist, are certainly contemporary with the emergence of Buddhism in Tibet, the emergence of the concepts of these different spirits and entities, and so those things do exist in Buddhism for sure. I mean, and I've heard all kinds of stories about some of these different aspects of Buddhism. So therefore, yes, you're right. On a pure philosophical level, you're absolutely right. Madhyamaka, that's absolutely true. When on the practitioner point of view, you could say the practicing yogi, local Nagpa kind of point of view, they're spirits, and you got to figure out how to work with them, right? Or deal with them. So there's all these different levels within Buddhism. It's not just, well, we got this pure Madhyamaka philosophical worldview, and there's no other elements. There are, right? So it has this complex dimension too.
Yes, that's quite right. Quite right. Absolutely fascinating. Yeah. This has been so cool. Thank you so much. American Gnosis. I can highly recommend it. It's an incredible read, and we've touched on various themes, and there's a lot more in there.
I really thank you for the chance to discuss it, discuss the book, and discuss these different subjects. We barely delved into the weirdness in the book. I mean, we barely touched on some of the weirdness in this book. And there is much, much more to be jarring to people than just the few things we've talked about. So thank you, Steve. I really appreciate the conversation.
I agree. This has been so fascinating. American Gnosis, out soon. I highly recommend it. Professor Arthur Versluis, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.